Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Mumford and Sons, titled Wilder Minds. So I've mentioned a couple of times that I'm a big fan of karaoke. Now, anybody who follows me on Twitter knows that I occasionally post my semi-witty observations whenever I head out to one of my favorite clubs or bars in order to sing. And one of the songs that I put on semi-permanent rotation for myself is Little Lion Man by Mumford and Sons. I mean, I can sing it well, I know the song pretty much by heart. It's got an anthemic vibe that plays incredibly well to a crowd and audience. One could make the argument that it's honestly the best song that Mumford and Sons ever wrote. One of the few where critics and fans alike could come together, listen, and acknowledge that the song really worked. It was really good. Because not since Nickelback will you find a more passionate and egregious divide between the critical press and the mainstream public than on the topic of Mumford and Sons. And honestly, I can see both sides of this. When the band broke in the last few years of the 2000s, they gained some attention from the mainstream public for having strong singles with some anthemic choruses and a ton of rollicking energy that rarely ever seemed to get popular in the mainstream, at least with this sort of acoustic vibe. And then through a quirk of fate, they actually did get popular with some real chart success that only increased with their second album, Babel, which launched a fair few singles on the Hot 100, won a Grammy, and solidified the folk boom of the early 2010s. And most of the critical set couldn't stand them, seeing them as a pop sellout of real folk music, one of the few genres left where a vestige of authenticity still mattered. And they weren't exactly wrong here. Mumford & Sons were slick and polished despite the folk instruments and especially despite the image, and Babel was even more so. And even despite the braying howl of Marcus Mumford's voice, the band had nowhere near the grit of acts like Old Crow Medicine Show or the Evett Brothers or any slew of alternative country folk acts. Now for me, the issue is kind of different, because I actually didn't mind the bluegrass-tinged Mumford & Sons sound, and I'm a sucker for a great stomping chorus, I can admit that. But the larger problem revealed itself in the framing of the songs and their lyrics, namely that they wrote a lot of catty, passive-aggressive songs about sour relationships and played them all with such serious, earnest power just to disguise all the nastiness of the material. That's why Little Lion Man, at least for me, remains their best song. At least they admit they were the ones who screwed things up, but beyond that, to this day, I'm still debating whether or not it's an issue of incompetence, the bargain barrel symbolism would support that, or just douchebaggery, but it sure as hell does not make Mumford & Sons remotely likable, especially considering how serious they took themselves. And just like Nickelback, their post-grunge parallel, their material gets kind of formulaic in a hurry, especially if you listen through an entire album front to back. It just kind of gets old. And thus, it wasn't exactly a surprise to me when I heard that the band had gotten so resentful and sick of their image and of the banjo that they dished them entirely for a straight-up electric rock sound, proving that the whole folk thing was transparent since the very beginning, but whatever, we all knew that. I'll admit, I was not looking forward to covering this release. I covered the lead-off single on Billboard Breakdown, and it sounded like a watered-down U2 wannabe, and I already heard Imagine Dragons try that earlier this year. So, I'll admit, I had low expectations, especially considering that the best element in their sound, the folk groove and the acoustic elements, now seem completely gone. But okay, even with that, what did Mumford & Sons deliver with Wilder Mind? Did we have something to work with here? Well, after plenty of listens to this album, the simplest way to describe it would be that it's an electric Mumford & Sons album, except minus the energy, spark, and unique flavor that at least made their earlier albums stand out. And what's even more frustrating is that it's not even an interesting failure or outright catastrophe. Mumford & Sons simply did what they always do, lyrically and thematically, and tried to fuse it through a very different instrumental framework. And man, at least for me, it just does not work at all. So okay, let's start with that big change up in the instrumentation and the production. Gone are the banjos and the majority of the acoustic elements, if not severely de-emphasized, and instead leaving behind a mix that's filled with sparse percussion, leaden bass lines, and fast-picked, noisy, fluttering guitars, with occasionally a little bit of piano and some strings to punch up the melody line. Now, if that description sounds generic for most rock music, it's mostly because this album really does not do a lot interesting instrumentally, since losing their fast-picked acoustic grooves, instead trying to compensate by adding some rougher guitar licks reminiscent of Snow Patrol midway into the mix, and some more ponderous elements that call to mind a lot of the National. Hell, they called in guitarist and producer Aaron Dessner from the National. And on some level, the comparison makes sense. But having gone back to revisit Trouble Will Find Me recently, the difference in melodic flow between the two is palpable. Even on more percussion-heavy segments, the National still had audible melodic fragments that accented the overall groove to keep the flow going throughout the verses and the chorus, whereas Mumford & Sons tends to keep them mostly isolated in the background in a blurry, reverb-thickened mass. And And that's a problem, given that while Snow Patrol and The National, they did use a fair bit of reverb and distortion to accent their melodies, normally being pretty sparse to be honest, Mumford & Sons is nowhere near as careful here. So you get moments like the choppy opening riff on The Wolf or the guitar pieces in the title track that get their melodies just caught up within all the feedback, and especially on any guitar solo on this album, especially on the tail end of this record, coupled with that loud soft dynamic that they just hammer with every single track. The crescendos that used to actually be some of the Mumford & Sons most potent assets, they're nowhere near as effective because it's just such an abrupt, sudden shift from one side to the other. So, okay, once again, we've got another record that tends to place percussion and groove over melody. But that's the other problem, in that many of the actual bass and rhythm lines are just completely underwhelming on this record, especially in comparison with Mumford & Sons' best songs. The bass progressions are generally the weakest link on this album, as they have nowhere near the texture or bite to really anchor the grooves or match the rougher guitars. And there's no sense of tension or aggression driving the presence, which dampens the emotional stakes even further. Now, that's not saying that they can't make some songs work and be kind of catchy. The more energetic hook of Tompkins Square Park, the country-sounding guitars that opened up Monster, really the best part of that song considering how misshapen and meandering that track is, the seething aggression of Snake Eyes and explosive second half of Only Love, thanks to actually having a real solid bass line on both tracks, the piano and gentle acoustic groove of Broad-Shouldered Beast. Hell, when this album actually manages to develop a real pulse, it can get at least a little bit interesting. But this ties into our second major change from earlier albums and a big problem: Marcus Mumford's delivery. In theory, I get what he was trying to do. Go for a lower, quieter, more intimate delivery. But man alive, is this an area where Mumford's narrow dramatic range just works against him. His voice works very well in broad strokes, on potent anthemic choruses, and delivery in this particular range demands a certain amount of subtlety that he doesn't really show off. At least when you can get raw and aggressive on louder songs, you could kind of buy it. But here it comes across as really wooden and lacking dramatic intensity, especially considering most of the choral vocals are best thrown off the album entirely. It gives the impression of disinterest or aloofness or detachment in comparison with someone like, say, Matt Berninger's very vulnerability and potence. It was intimate. And believe me, this is the wrong attitude that Mumford takes with these tracks. And that's all because of the lyrics. And look, it's a Mumford & Sons album. They haven't exactly evolved much lyrically beyond slightly better structure and flow and a more interesting metaphor or two. But thematically, it feels like we're treading ground that we've already seen twice before on earlier albums. Fractured, bitter relationship songs that when you peel back the layers, the more ugliness you find here. And it doesn't help that Mumford's low-key delivery comes across as incredibly passive-aggressive, even more than usual, with the lyrics often cementing that. Take the lead-off single, Believe, prime example, presenting disillusionment before the loud segments brave for this assertion of love. But if he doesn't believe before, why would he believe it now? It just comes across as needy and passive-aggressive. The Wolf, they switches out passive aggression for just condescension, as he spends the verses judging the poor state of his lover. You have been weighed, you have been found wanting. And yet Mumford will manage to be there so long as you leave your wanton ways. Or, as he puts it on Monster, easily the worst track on this album, if she is to go to the place of no return with them, actually hook up for a long-term relationship, fuck your dreams, because that's the way you want to start a long-term relationship. The breakup songs are handled at least a little bit better, although tracks like Broad-Shouldered Beast, they do push it for me, where she's about to dump him and she doesn't have the courage, and thus Mumford feels that he must provoke her enough to push her to that necessary edge. Kind of melodramatic here. Or take the bad relationship of Cold Arms, where she's clearly uncomfortable and kind of upset within this relationship, and yet she stays regardless because Mumford implies that it's better than nothing. It's kind of like Better Man by Pearl Jam, written from the perspective of that asshole. The best breakup track on this album is Tompkins Square Park, because it's at least weary, mature acceptance considering that he did lie to her and broke her trust, and that's a legit reason to get dumped. But it's counterbalanced by Hot Gates, the closer, an attempt to console a suicidal friend, and yet includes the lines, "Why do you always speak when you have no grace in your precious face?" And it seems like Mumford is more aggrieved that the person is actually breaking their promise to him that they wouldn't commit suicide than the actual act of committing suicide. And this ties back to the issue that I've always had with the songwriting of Mumford & Sons, and especially with this album: the framing. The songs might imply that the protagonists have problems or they've done this person wrong, but never on the same level as his partners, who are portrayed as capricious, insecure, frequently in over their heads, petty, or on a track like Snake Eyes, downright sinister. At least I can respect that last song for kind of pulling off the Man-Eater vibe, actually a pretty good song, and not going back to her. But the larger issue ties back to Mumford's vocal delivery. When you come across as aloof or detached from the situation, the message implied is that he's the one being reasonable in the face of all these relationships, and he's the one making all the sacrifices. And what's all worse is there's no moment that punctures the brutal arrogance of it all. Take Ditmos, where she accused him of changing when he clearly never has changed, and now she wants to leave. Maybe engaging in a dialogue might actually be able to help instead of just dismissing her as roving and never committed unless she changed him. Themes that are echoed again on the title track and were never an issue for him. He was never going to leave because he had been blessed with a wilder mind. And if it was implied anywhere, the protagonist might be a judgmental asshole, or maybe that he's not even seeing the whole picture, that the framing was broader, could maybe excuse it, but we don't see that in Mumford's delivery or in the writing. If I were to find maybe one exception, it'd probably be Only Love, the song where Mumford's immaturity actually backfires on him and he gets dumped, which he at least admits because it probably wasn't right, and yet it probably would have been better if he had realized that something later with this woman down the road was probably destined never to work. But that would require a level of sophistication in the framing that this album just does not have. In other words, the more I've listened through and analyzed Wilder Mind, the more that just manages to turn my stomach. The best thing that I can say is that there are elements of good performances on some tracks that I can appreciate. Even if they don't do it all that well, there are moments that were appropriating Snow Patrol and The National does pay enough dividends given that I like both bands. But when you pair it with such an underwhelming vocal performance and lyrics that just set my teeth on edge, I can't recommend this. I'm sorry. Even at least when Mumford and Sons had folk earnestness, they could plead ignorance in their anthems and make up for it with just thunderous power. You could blame incompetence. With Wilder Mind, we don't have that. This is clear forethought, and that makes it all the worse. That said, I'm not going to deny that there are moments where even some of the more sour moments do have some resonance on a deeper level. Most because even though I can't stand the fact that I empathize here, I've been in analogous situations. I've had those condescending or detached thoughts on points. The difference is that I've got the hindsight to put things in the larger context, which this album doesn't have the energy, intensity, or lyrical ability to pull off. I'm thinking a strong 4 out of 10 is appropriate, and definitely not a recommendation. If you want to hear this sound done right, look up Trouble Will Find Me by The National back from 2013, or hopefully Snow Patrol will be dropping a new album this year. They're working on it, I hope it's coming. If Mumford & Sons left folk rock and they left it for this, I reckon it won't be long before they're either back or just irrelevant. And honestly, not a moment too soon. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I can't imagine how this review will piss some of you off. Just keep it civil in the comments. You guys, it might have worked for you. And on some level, it worked for me, but it appealed to my worst impulses, and I'm not giving it a pass for that. In any case, if there's anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any other albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.